Japan in our world was the only East Asian nation to modernize and industrialize in the 1800s, becoming the main might on the continent and soon going on to dominate it. Their empire fell apart after the loss to the USA in World War II, but what they were able to achieve in the 70 years beforehand was truly brain-sparking for an East Asian nation in the time of Western domination over the world. So this begs the question, what if this modernization, and thus Japanese imperialism and broad growth outwards, never happened? What effects would it have on Asia and the world? That we shall explore in this video. In this world, there is no Meiji Restoration, thus no Boshin War, and none of the outcoming effects. This means that Japan keeps being exploited by the European powers. Unequal treaties keep being upheld, and we'll also say that the West takes a harder stance on keeping the shogunate at the helm in Japan for the sake of keeping the nation weak. I don't see Japan being colonized like some other East Asian nations were. They were a bit too far away for that to be likely. I mean, it could happen, but I find it more likely that the Europeans would strong-arm the Japanese into giving up big harbor cities, with places like Nagasaki and Kagoshima becoming European holdings. British, German, Russian, what have you merchants would sap the lifeblood out of Japan through taking of wealth, like they did to the Chinese. The small outlying islands would likely be downright colonized, most likely by mostly the British, with the Russians taking Hokkaido as a big prize. Speaking of Russia, they'd fare very well in this world. Without the Japanese to stint them in East Asia, Manchuria would likeliest be nimmed by the Russians. The Russians already invaded Manchuria a few times in the 1890s and 1900s in our world, and had built the South Manchuria Railway running down to Mukden, now known as Shenyang. The seizure of Manchuria would also drag Korea into Russia's sphere of influence. Britain would be frightened by Russia towing such a great share of China into their holdings, and the annexation of Hokkaido would be a last straw. Britain would fight the Russians in Manchuria, diplomatically and economically, looking to thwart their influence there. There would be a great game of sorts like what happened in Afghanistan between the British and Russians, with the Japanese being the soccer ball kick between the two. This might make British and Russian ties worse going into the 1900s, but with Germany rising, I don't think World War I would be that different. One thing, though, is that Germany's Pacific holdings would be taken by the British rather than the Japanese, with Tsingtao likely as falling to the Russians. Dynasty would likely as take longer to fall in China, with China being slightly less weakened thanks to no loss against Japan, a fellow East Asian nation. Not much longer, though. The unstable dynasty was doomed to fall soon enough, but I'd say it'd be thrust back a few years in this world. With Japan and Korea being hinged to Russia, this means that when Russia would go communist in the 1920s, they'd set up communist puppet states in Korea and Japan. These new governments would be deeply unpopular, effectively making these nations into police states only held up by the might of the USSR. An unmodernized Japan wouldn't have any good naval might to shield itself. With the Soviets holding Korea and Japan, they'd be tugged into the industrial age in the same way the Soviets were. Japan and Korea would modernize at about this time, but they wouldn't gain a healthy and steady industrial economy. Instead, like they did in their own nation, the Soviets would hone in on heavy industry in their puppet states, making them desperately poor and nothing more than extra factories for the Soviets to use. Japan and Korea would be made to build up their navies, which would scare the USA and Britain to no end. There'd be clashings between the USA and Anglosphere in Asia, with the Soviets propping up the communists in warlord times, and the USA and Britain doing whatever was needed to stop them, so as not to let the Soviets get even stronger in that swath of the world, possibly threatening British colonies. Things would truly switch up once we get to World War II. Without Japan to threaten the USA, there would be no Pearl Harbor or buildup of tension in East Asia. This means that the USA wouldn't ever straight up join World War II. Lend-Lease and such would still keep up, but I don't see Roosevelt getting the American folk in Congress to back a full war without some kind of casus belli. Also, the Americans would be less aggressive with only one totalitarian power, Germany, invading neighboring nations rather than two, with Japan never doing so. And Germany would likely take fewer gambles against the USA without Japan to have as a naval ally. The US never joining means that Congress likeliest wouldn't have agreed to ramp up Lend-Lease to the same level as it got to in our world, leading to Soviet counterattacks grinding to a halt sometime after Stalingrad, or some alternate campaign like it. No USA means no huge US Air Force to play the biggest part in bombing German industry, help wreck the Luftwaffe, help shield and reinforce British planes, what have you. All in all, we'd see the war grind to a stalemate, with a border being drawn between the Germans and Soviets, likely in the mid to late 40s, and Britain dropping out of the war, even if Churchill didn't want to, after seeing that beating the Germans was downright hopeless. No Japan means no Japanese invasion of China, which means that the communists couldn't take advantage of a weakened KMT to take hold of China, and also the Soviets would already have Manchuria and thus wouldn't hand it over to the Chinese communists. This means that the nationalists would win in China. With a nationalist victory, China would choose capitalism and join the world economy far earlier, rising to become a superpower by the 1990s. In the end, we'd see a world like this take shape. Germany and the Soviets bitterly stare each other down in Europe, waiting for a chance to take the other down. Britain leans on the USA, with the two doing their best to stop the Germans and Soviets from getting too strong. the Germans, Soviets, and Anglos would all compete against each other for world domination. So what would be the fate of Japan? Odds are the Soviets still fall apart in this world, but it would take longer, since the Soviets would cling harder to their government for the sake of shielding from the Germans. And since it would take a while before China, their only link to the outside world besides Germany, would become mark-worthy enough to influence them. The internet too would play a role. But by the 2000s, communism would still fall apart. Korea and Japan would come out of this as woefully poor nations. Years and years of first no modernization, then communism would have turned them into small Russias. Shells of economies, hinging on heavy industry. They'd have big militaries, yet dearly little else. They might be able to recover and become wealthy, but this wouldn't happen until at least the middle of the century. Japan and Korea today are poor, miserable nations with dysfunctional economies, small populations, and are horrible places to live. I hope you all enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.